The identity of the serial killer known to us now as Jack the Ripper, probably the most notorious serial killer in criminal history, has, since the 1888 Autumn of Terror, been an enduring cause for speculation and robust debate. Serving and retired police officers, esteemed criminologists from the FBI, an array of criminal profilers and other experts, and an endless march of amateur sleuths have spilt oceans of ink in hot pursuit of a man who remains as elusive today as he did in late 19th century Whitechapel. His almost supernatural ability to evade capture has given rise over the past century to the myth of a phantom-like villain who has rather frustratingly morphed into something of an East End folk hero. Whoever this man was, he most certainly was no supervillain, let alone a hero. It does not serve us well to make monsters out of men who do bad things. The Ripper was a man of flesh and blood. He was not the incarnation of some preternatural evil. He was a broken and sick man, a murderous psychopath and a sexual sadist who preyed upon the weakest, most vulnerable, defenceless and marginalised women in London's hellishly impoverished East End. Following Charles Eade's oft-quoted piece of cereal box psychology that hurt people, the ghoul responsible for the Whitechapel murders was a profoundly broken and sick man who projected his inner twistedness out and into the flesh of the mutilated bodies of his victims. Whatever we do with Jack the Ripper and men like him, let us not make heroes, or worse, vaudeville comic villains of them. These creatures are the very worst of our nature, the stuff of nightmare and horror for sure, but always and forever, like Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the embodiment of the deepest, shadowy depths of our own shared human nature. Men are more terrifying than monsters. In February 1894, in response to what he felt was wild speculation in the press, Melville Macnaghten, who, although not being part of the investigation in 1888, was active in the investigation into the murders from 1889 to 1891, penned a confidential memorandum, the Macnaghten Memorandum, setting out his professional and informed opinions on the case. It is thanks to this document, which was not published in its entirety until 1975, that we now have the canonical 5 victims and his preferred suspects, Druitt, Kosminski and Ostrog. Macnaghten was of course responding to the Sun newspaper's series accusing Thomas Hayne Cutbush of the crimes, but the police never bought him as a suspect at the time. Various senior members of the Metropolitan and the City of London police forces did, however, have their favourite suspects, but they could not, in the main, agree with one another, and from his retirement in March 1903, although he was much taken with the coincidences linking George Chapman to the Ripper case, Frederick George Abberline stated most emphatically to the Pall Mall Gazette that Scotland Yard is really no wiser on the subject than it was 15 years ago. Regardless of the Macnaghten Memorandum and the speculations of senior officers involved in the case, the truth is that by the first half of the first decade of the 20th century, the investigation was no further forward and the trail had gone cold. Over the course of a century since the murders, the list of suspects has only grown, from the most fanciful to the plausible. It was not until October 2006 when Michael Connor, in an article he published in Ripperologist, fielded a new suspect, that things really started rolling again. Considering Charles Cross, the Pickford's carman, who discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols on Box Row on the 31st of August 1888, he noted, Cross was visible, and was exactly the sort of person everyone expected to find on the streets. Whatever lay hidden behind the sacking apron, or what he looked like without it, he belonged in Bethnal Green and Whitechapel. What differentiates him from any other anonymous shadow is that he was found in Bucks Row beside the body of Polly Nichols when he should have been far away on his way to work. Over the past 2 instalments of the present investigation, we have learned a good deal of information about this man, Carman Cross. And the more we have learned, the more suspect he seems to become. At the inquest into the death of Polly Nichols, he gave his name as Charles Allen Cross and denied telling PC Jonas Misen he was wanted by another policeman in Bucks Row. We learned that he told 2 significant lies to Misen at the scene of the crime, and that the name he gave was false. We also discovered that both Bucks Row, where Nichols was killed, and 29 Hanbury Street, where Annie Chapman was slain days later on the 8th of September, were on his route to work. English legal expert and criminal barrister James Scobie KC is on record in the 2014 television documentary The Missing Evidence, Jack the Ripper, stating that Charles Allen Lechmere, the man who called himself Cross at the Nichols inquest in September 1888, has a prima facie case to answer. In light of the evidence that has been piled against him by Connor, Christer Holmgren, Edward Stow and others, there is most definitely a case to be answered. So, in this 3rd instalment, Murder in Whitechapel, The Crown versus Lechmere, we will set out the case for the prosecution, laying out in a systematic manner the contents of the book of evidence against him. You, dear viewer, are called upon to be the jury. Before beginning, I would like to express my thanks to Christer Holmgren for his ongoing consultation, for pointing out my previous mistakes, which we will correct on the record as we go, and for the tremendous amount of work he has done in building a case against the accused. Now, without further ado, all rise and silence in court. At 3:45 in the morning of the 31st of August 1888, John Neal, a London Metropolitan Police Constable from J Division, Bethnal Green, number 97, discovered the body of a murdered woman later identified as Mary Ann Nichols, a resident of White House, 56 Flower and Dean Street, Whitechapel, a common lodging house. With the aid of his police-issue bullseye lamp, he discovered the victim's throat to be cut and blood oozing and running from the wound in her neck. Hearing a constable passing on Brady Street to the east, this was PC John Thane, 96J, Neal called to him, not using his whistle so as not to alert the neighbourhood to the incident, and sent him to fetch Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn from his home above his surgery at 152 Whitechapel Road. Another constable, PC Jonas Misen, 56H, then entered Bucks Row from Baker's Row to the west, and Neal at once sent him for an ambulance. The victim was dead at 3:45 when Neal discovered her. But when did she die? According to Dr. Llewellyn's recollection, on the 1st of September, the afternoon of the day following the murder, PC John Thane arrived at his home at 4 a.m. That is about 15 minutes after PC John Neal discovered the body. In his deposition at the inquest, PC Neal remarked that the doctor arrived in a very short time. We have no definite time for his arrival, but allowing for him to dress quickly, remember he had been summoned by the police, and make the 5-minute walk to the scene of the crime, his arrival at the scene can be placed safely to no later than 4:15. Upon examining Nichols' body, Dr. Llewellyn found that she was dead and concluded she had not been dead more than half an hour. By his professional assessment, the victim, Mary Ann Nichols, died very close to the time of her discovery by PC John Neal at 3:45. But Neal saw no one, saying there was not a soul about. At the time of her discovery, PC Neal noted that blood was oozing and running from the wound in her throat. However, on his return to the scene with Dr. Llewellyn, PC John Thane reported that there was now a quantity of congealed blood. Blood does not take long to congeal. It is part of the natural behaviour of fibrin in blood to polymerise outside the body, and the normal time range for this process to occur is between 2 and 8 minutes. This piece of evidence, taken with PC Neal's observation of blood oozing and running when he found the body, permits us to say with a reasonable degree of certainty that Polly Nichols had been attacked no longer than 2 to 8 minutes before he arrived on the scene. Moreover, Neal stated there was a pool of blood just where her neck was lying when he first saw the body at 3:45. A fresh pool of blood that was not seen by Robert Paul, the carman who had moments earlier discovered Charles Lechmere standing where the woman was, before continuing on out of Box Row with Lechmere to search for a policeman. Robert Paul got close enough to the body of the victim to feel for signs of life, and yet did not see blood about her. Following his post-mortem examination of the body in the nearby Whitechapel workhouse mortuary on Old Montague Street, conducted later on the same day as the murder, Dr. Llewellyn noted of her injuries. An inch below on the same side and commencing about an inch in front of it was a circular incision terminating at a point about 3 inches below the right jaw. This incision completely severs all the tissues down to the vertebrae. The large vessels of the neck on both sides were severed. Taken with Robert Paul's sworn testimony on the 3rd day of the inquest at the Working Lads Institute on the Whitechapel Road, that he detected a slight movement, as of breathing but very faint, this evidence is important in determining the time of Nichols' death. Mr. Paul was looking for signs of life, and he detected a very faint movement which he took to be breathing. Moments before the arrival of PC John Neal, Robert Paul saw a man, Charles Allen Lechmere, standing where the woman was. When asked to examine the woman, Paul testified he felt something like a faint breathing. Consider then Llewellyn's report. The incision completely severs all the tissues down to the vertebrae. The large vessels on the neck on both sides were severed. For all intents and purposes, the victim had been decapitated. All connection between the body and the nervous system had been cut. This savage slash would have resulted in instantaneous death and the immediate cessation of voluntary bodily function. Breathing, in the normal sense, was simply not possible after this injury had been inflicted. Paul felt movement, but this movement was most certainly not breathing. It was put to Christer Holmgren, the author of Cutting Point: Solving the Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Murders, 2021, by Ingemar Thiblin, a professor of forensic medicine at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, that this movement may have been agonal breathing. Agonal respiration, gasping respiration or agonal breathing, is a distinct abnormal pattern of breathing and brainstem reflex characterised by gasping, laboured breathing accompanied by strange vocalisations and myoclonus. Possible causes include cerebral ischemia, extreme hypoxia, inadequate oxygen supply to tissue, or even anoxia, total depletion of oxygen. Agonal breathing is an extremely serious medical sign requiring immediate medical attention, as the condition generally progresses to complete apnea and heralds death. The duration of agonal respiration can be as brief as 2 breaths or last up to several hours. For sure, this would explain what Paul felt, but it appears not to take into account the full extent of the injuries. Human beings are cephalocentric animals. Without a connection to the brain, the regular animation of muscle throughout the body is not possible. While the heart, which has its own electrical system, will continue to beat faintly after decapitation, the muscular movement required for agonal breathing is not possible. If we are to follow Llewellyn's findings then, this movement is something else. When a human body is decapitated, the energy stored in the muscular structure, which in vivo gives the body muscle tone, is released, resulting in involuntary spasmodic convulsions which will last no more than 2 minutes. If this analysis is correct, the faint movement detected by Robert Paul indicates that the effective decapitation of Nichols happened less than 2 minutes before he arrived on the scene of the crime and witnessed the accused standing where the victim was. All of this evidence assists us in determining with some certainty the time of Mary Ann Nichols' death. At 3:45, PC John Neal discovered Polly's body. Blood was oozing and running. It had not yet begun to clot and congeal, a process which takes up to 8 minutes under normal conditions. At about 4:15, Dr. Llewellyn determined the deceased had not been dead for more than 30 minutes, putting the time of her death to about 3:45. Moments before Neal's discovery, Robert Paul examined the body in the company of Charles Lechmere and detected what appears to have been an involuntary muscular spasm, the dying motions of a decapitated body which will not last more than 2 minutes. Notwithstanding Paul's assertion that he entered Bucks Row at 3:45, it may have been 1 or 2 minutes before this. The assault on Nichols, likely a blitz attack, must have been perpetrated no earlier than 3:40. This case then will place the time of her death to between 3:40 and 3:44 a.m. Time for a brief intermission. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I do hope you are enjoying the show. I am Jason Michael McCann, the creator of the Inspector Abberline channel. This is just the quickest of quick notices that you can become a patron of the show by making a small contribution on Patreon. The details are in the description below. Each episode involves a gargantuan amount of work. Research, recording, sound and video editing and such. Your support would go a long way to make everything easier and so much better. It would be most welcome. Regardless, if you appreciate the work of this channel, do please like and subscribe. This does magic for the algorithm, and please do enjoy the rest of the show. Christer Holmgren and Edward Stow, two excellent ripperologists and researchers, are correct in their identification of Robert Paul as the most important witness in the Nichols case. Eyewitness testimony is reliably unreliable in criminal investigations, but this is not to say it is entirely worthless. Given the series of lies we know Charles Lechmere to have told, we can take his witness testimony as the first person on the scene with a pinch of salt. Yet Robert Paul, for his part, is exactly what the accused was assumed to be, an ordinary working man, a carman, making his way to work through the rough streets of Whitechapel in the early hours of the morning. Regardless of some obvious embellishment and spin from the press, his account of the events has nothing to hide. Albeit with a critical reading, we can take his version of events at face value. With police constables like Jonas Misen knocking people up for work, Robert Paul arose on the morning of the 31st of August 1888, readied himself and left his home at 30 Foster Street in Whitechapel and made his way to work at Covent Garden Fruit and Vegetable Market. According to the report published in Lloyd's Weekly, Sunday the 2nd of September, it was exactly 3:45 when Mr Paul passed up Bucks Row. This is the same time PC John Neal gives for his discovery of the body, so clearly there is some confusion somewhere. Paul says not more than 4 minutes had passed since he first saw the woman and when he reached PC Misen at the crossing of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row. And so he and Lechmere would have left the scene moments before the arrival of John Neal. His time then must be an approximation. PC Misen says it was 3:45 when the carman, Charles Lechmere, in company with another man, Robert Paul, spoke to him. All 3 police constables mark 3:45 as either the time of discovery, PC's Neal and Thane, or the time a report was made to them, PC Misen, making it safer to follow the police timings here, but the times are close. With this correction, Robert Paul arrived on Bucks Row at or about 3:41 and saw a man standing where the woman was. This man was Charles Lechmere. Like PC John Neal, Robert Paul reported that he saw no one else on his way to work. He saw no one running away. Paul was being extra vigilant. We know he was on his guard because, as he said, he knew the dangerous character of the locality, and further stated that few people like to come up and down here without being on their guard, for there are such terrible gangs about. There have been many knocked down and robbed at this spot. Evidently then, Robert Paul was a man with his wits about him. He was not going to be easily mistaken about what he saw. Even before being alerted to the presence of the victim lying on the road, he was on the lookout for danger. In fact, he did see danger. When he saw that man, that is, Charles Lechmere, standing where the woman was, he took evasive action. He attempted to give him a wide berth. These words, "I tried to give him a wide berth," constitute a crucial piece of witness testimony. Yes, whilst Robert Paul was being extra vigilant, he was also a resident of the locality. He knew the various types of character one would encounter in Whitechapel in the early hours. By long experience, he would be able to distinguish intuitively the behaviourisms and body language of the people in this area. Remember, he is a native of these streets. Yet his intuition led him to make an effort to avoid this other man, without him saying it in words, and perhaps even without him being entirely conscious of it himself. Paul's recollection informs us that there was something suspicious about Lechmere. He may even have put words to this apprehension. The Star newspaper's coverage of the inquest records, "He started as though he thought the witness was going to knock him down." It is also important to note here that this was the first account made by Paul on the day of the murder, when he was returning from work. Now we have our first frame of reference for Charles Lechmere being alone at the scene of the crime, at and before about 3:41. Robert Paul did not see or hear him walking ahead of him as he made his way from Foster Street to Bucks Row, and the work boots worn by both men would have been audible and distinctive on the cobbled streets. Robert Paul was entirely unaware of the presence of Charles Lechmere until he had walked a short distance into Bucks Row and saw him in the darkness where the woman was. All of this means Lechmere had arrived at the crime scene a considerable time before Paul's arrival, and he had been there long enough to ascertain that it was a woman lying in front of Brown Stable Yard Gate beside the new cottage at the end of the row of artisan dwellings before the board school building. We can turn now to Lechmere's inquest testimony, which was given on the second day of the inquest, the day after Robert Paul's remarkable statement was published. And, guilty or innocent, given that he was the first on the scene and was discovered alone with Nichols' body, it is essential we view his evidence through a hermeneutical lens of suspicion. This is simply good investigative practice. About 3:30 on Friday, he says, he left his home to go to work and passed through Bucks Row. He discerned on the opposite side something lying against the gateway, but he could not at once make out what it was. He thought it was a tarpaulin sheet. He walked into the middle of the road and saw that it was the figure of a woman. He then heard the footsteps of a man going up Bucks Row, about 40 yards away, in the direction that he himself had come from. While it was the practice of newspapers at the time to print the addresses of witnesses, only one newspaper, The Star, gives Lechmere's home address, 22 Doveton Street, strongly implying the witness was not speaking loudly, though this is speculation. Christer Holmgren and Edward Stow have reconstructed and timed Lechmere's journey from 22 Doveton Street to Brown Stable Yard on Bucks Row, providing times of 7 minutes 7 seconds and 7 minutes 33 seconds respectively. This puts Charles Lechmere, by his own account, on the scene of the crime at 3:37, 4 minutes before the arrival of Robert Paul. The attack on Nichols would not have lasted more than 2 or 3 minutes, a blitz attack. And we know from the nature of the other crimes that in this case the attacker was interrupted, not completing his post-mortem mutilation ritual. This certainly fits with the 3:40 time of death, and Charles Lechmere was at the scene with Nichols by at least 3:37. Interestingly, the only newspaper reporter to have caught Lechmere's home address also reported a different time for his departure from 22 Doveton Street that morning, 20 minutes past 3. We know this reporter was in attendance at the inquest and he was paying attention. Other papers may have simply been copying and reprinting a mishearing. Again, this is speculation. However, in either event, Charles Allen Lechmere was at the scene of the crime between 3 and 13 minutes before Nichols' likely time of death and between 4 and 14 minutes before the arrival of Robert Paul. He said himself that he heard no one running away, and neither did the night watchman a few yards away in Winthrop Street. By any rational interpretation of the evidence and the witness statements, Charles Allen Lechmere arrived at the scene of the crime before Nichols died. He was far enough ahead of Robert Paul that the latter did not see or hear him until he arrived at the scene. Alfred Mulshaw, the night watchman on Winthrop Street, heard no one, and neither did the 3 police constables in the vicinity. Charles Lechmere was entirely alone when he was at the scene of the crime at exactly the time Mary Ann Nichols was murdered. It is put to you that Mary Ann Nichols was violently assaulted on Bucks Row off the Whitechapel Road at about 3:37 and died between 3:40 and 3:44 at the scene in the early hours of Friday the 31st of August 1888. It is also put to you that a Mr Charles Allen Lechmere was at the scene of the crime from at least 3:37, possibly even from as early as 3:27, that he was alone with the victim at the time of her assault and death. It follows then that Charles Lechmere is a person of interest in this case, and indeed the prime suspect. The Crown's case is that Charles Lechmere of 22 Doveton Street, Whitechapel, London, did wilfully attack, kill and grievously mutilate Miss Mary Ann Nichols, and so here we shall set out the case for the prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there is, As the defence will no doubt remind you, no smoking gun in this case, no murder weapon was found at the scene, not one of the other witnesses saw or heard a struggle or anyone fleeing the scene. Robert Paul and Police Constable John Neal agree in their testimonies that there was not a soul about. Alfred Mulshaw saw and heard no one, though he may have been napping. PC John Thane searched Essex Wharf, the Great Eastern Railway arches, and East London Railway line, and the District Railway as far as Thames Street, and detected no marks of blood or anything of a suspicious character. There is no aha moment in the case against the defendant. In fact, the Crown's case is built entirely on circumstantial evidence. Now, many labour under the false impression that such evidence, circumstantial evidence, is not enough to convict a suspect in a capital murder prosecution. Let me assure you, this is certainly not the case. The notion that one cannot be convicted on circumstantial evidence is, of course, false. Most criminal convictions are based on circumstantial evidence, although it must be adequate to meet established standards of proof. Any jury would be extremely slow to convict on the basis of any single piece of circumstantial evidence. Being found at the scene of the crime, for example, as Charles Lechmere was, is not necessarily enough to meet the said established standards of proof. We shall freely concede this ground to the defence. And this we shall do because the Crown's case does not rely on a single strand of mere circumstantial evidence, but on a surfeit of such evidence. The Crown will establish that the threshold of proof is crossed in this case by one piece of circumstantial evidence too many, over and over again. It will be put to you, according to the principles of Occam's razor, that the simplest explanation of the known facts is the correct explanation, that the weight of circumstantial evidence in this case establishes the guilt of Charles Lechmere beyond reasonable doubt. Our honourable friend Mr Rumbelow, acting counsel for the defence, will tell you Charles Lechmere was innocently making his way to work through Box Row when he spied what he thought was a discarded sheet of tarpaulin lying in front of the gate of Brown's stable yard, and that on closer inspection he was shocked to discover it was the body of a woman. Mr Lechmere must be commended for his desire to recycle such a useful item. We would all do well to reduce, reuse and recycle, but this account is problematic to say the least. A red flag, as Edward Stow is wont to say. Are we to accept that Mr Lechmere, knowing as we do the testimony of Robert Paul that this was a dangerous area, was uniquely unafraid to stop in the dark while running late for work in order to salvage a discarded piece of rubbish? Especially when his place of work, the Pickford's depot at Broad Street, had a tarpaulin store. Are we to accept that after discovering it was a woman, dead or drunk, he loitered alone with her in the dark for between 3 and 8 minutes, if we are to accept Paul's timing, without raising the alarm? Neither does his decision to approach Robert Paul 3 or 8 minutes later to call his attention to the woman remove suspicion. It does the opposite. Mr Paul felt threatened by his approach and tried to give him a wide berth. Something about Charles Lechmere's demeanour clearly unsettled Robert Paul. The defence will argue that had Lechmere killed Nichols, and that had he been disturbed in the act of mutilating her body by Robert Paul, it would have made more sense for him to flee the scene. But this is a nonsense. Paul would have raised the alarm, and the noise of Lechmere's boots on the cobbled streets would have had him apprehended by any one or a number of the bobbies we know to have been on their beats in the immediate vicinity. Paul felt intimidated precisely because Mr Lechmere was a threat to him. Charles Lechmere had little option in that moment but to ascertain what Robert Paul had seen and to act the innocent, or neutralise the threat. Robert Paul's intuition was on point. And after learning Robert Paul had seen nothing, Lechmere concocted a narrative in which he found a woman lying by the gate and asked Paul to come and investigate it with him. Problem here is that Charles Lechmere had already investigated the body. Paul detected movement, likely a post-mortem spasm, possibly agonal respiration following her effective decapitation, and both men, acting to preserve her modesty, rearranged her clothing. This detail is truly fascinating. Robert Paul helped Charles Lechmere pull her skirts down, which had been hiked up to her waist. Unbeknownst to Paul at the time, his assistance here would have covered over the eviscerating injuries to her abdominal area and groin. Yet, when he suggested they prop her up, Lechmere refused to touch her. Giving her a prop would have immediately revealed to Robert Paul the true and horrific extent of the injuries to her neck. This would have raised the alarm. Lechmere, in his deposition, appears to suggest it was Robert Paul who refused to touch her further. But this is unsustainable, as we know from Paul's own account that he had no issue touching her. It was he who felt for a heartbeat and helped to pull her skirts down. Lechmere's misprision at the inquest is deliberate and highly manipulative. Perhaps less than a minute before PC Neil's beat brought him back into Box Row, Charles Lechmere and Robert Paul left together on their way to work, seeking a policeman on the way. At 3:45, two things happened. Lechmere and Paul ran into PC Misen at the crossing of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row, and PC John Neil re-entered Box Row and discovered the body of Polly Nichols, missing the carman by the narrowest of margins. Charles Lechmere, seeking to control the narrative, approached PC Misen alone, out of earshot of Robert Paul. And we know this because he told two lies Paul would have corrected. The first, that Misen was wanted by a policeman in Box Row, and the second, that the woman was merely lying down. He said nothing of the suspicion that she was dead. Later, at the inquest, Lechmere would lie again, denying he had said this to PC Misen. When he attended the inquest at the Working Lads Institute on the Whitechapel Road on Monday the 3rd of September, having not come forward until after the publication of Robert Paul's account in Lloyd's Weekly, he presented himself as Charles Allen Cross rather than by his real name, Charles Allen Lechmere. Stephen Blomer, an expert for the defence, has suggested, with some merit, that he used the name Cross because this was the name of his stepfather, Thomas Cross, a police constable who listed Charles as Charles Allen Cross in the 1861 census, and that he possibly used this name for work because his stepfather maybe helped him secure that employment. What our honourable friend Mr Blomer does not have, however, is a single shred of material or documentary evidence to support this assertion. As an 11-year-old child, Charles Lechmere is enumerated in the 1861 census as Charles Allen Cross. This is a matter of fact. In no other census or official document does he use this name. He always lists himself as Charles Allen Lechmere. His wife takes the name Lechmere, and all of their children are given the name Lechmere. Lechmere's own use of the name Cross is most interesting. He only ever uses it, as we see in the official records, as a matter of verifiable historical fact when he is dealing with the law. Other than his use of Cross at the inquest into the death of Mary Nichols on the 3rd of September 1888, there is only one other documented case of his use of the name Cross, at another inquest into a fatal accident. Reporting on the inquest into the death of a 4-year-old Walter Williams in December 1876, the Islington Gazette reports, Charles Lechmere, Carman to Pickford's & Co. said he was crossing with his van from Copenhagen Street to Elizabeth Street when two children seemed to come from behind a trap that was standing on the off side, all in an instant running against his horse. He tried to pull up, but found it was impossible. It is worth noting here that the father of the child, also called Walter Williams, had reason to believe the man who called himself Charles Cross, a Pickford's carman, was to blame for his son's death. The defence cannot present a single piece of documentary evidence supporting its claim Charles Lechmere used the name Cross professionally, but the Crown has at hand documents supporting two very important facts. He consistently used the name Lechmere throughout his life, and used the name Cross when it involved legal inquiries into deaths with which he is in some way associated. These are demonstrable facts, supported by evidence. This detail shares a remarkable similarity with the arrest of Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, on the 2nd of January 1981, when he identified himself to South Yorkshire Police at his arrest in Sheffield as Peter Williams. Here I would like to express thanks to C. Rose in the comments for correcting my mistake in the last episode when I erroneously said this was Coonan. In both cases, Cross and Williams were family-adjacent names used by offenders in an effort to conceal their true identities. When the only times that Charles Lechmere uses the surname Cross to identify himself is in relation to crime, it looks a little too much like he is trying to hide his identity. When Lechmere had given his dubious report to PC Misen, a report that would have given the policeman no reason to detain the two carmen, both he and Robert Paul continued together down Hanbury Street, a detail which allowed Michael Connor in 2006 to reconstruct Lechmere's most likely route to work. With a single exception, that of the murder of Elizabeth Stride on Berner Street, the route between 22 Doveton Street and the Broad Street Pickford's Depot passes the location of all the Whitechapel murder sites, both canonical and non-canonical. And true to the form of a commuter killer modus via, this marks the eastern and western boundaries of the Ripper's criminal range. Charles Lechmere even provides us with a time frame for this walk to work, between 3:20 and 4 a.m. With the notable exceptions of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, we know Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly were killed at a time which would have allowed for Lechmere to be at the Broad Street depot for 4 a.m. The defence will no doubt counter this in two lines: that the murders of the double event, Stride and Eddowes, do not fit this pattern or timescale, and the time of Annie Chapman's murder at 29 Hanbury Street. Mr George Bagster Phillips, a police surgeon with over 20 years' experience and an appointee of the Royal College of Surgeons, a man of considerable and recognised medical and surgical expertise, arrived at 29 Hanbury Street at 6:30 in the morning of the 8th of September 1888 and determined the victim, Annie Chapman, had died more than 2 hours earlier, at or before 4:30 a.m. While the coroner, Wyn Edwin Baxter, ultimately accepted the later time of death following other witness statements, evidence Scotland Yard described as doubtful, the official police position was to accept a time of death about 4 a.m. or shortly before. The time accepted by Scotland Yard puts the murder at a time we now know Lechmere would have been passing through Hanbury Street, right past the door of number 29. To reject the 4 a.m. or earlier time is to discount both the Metropolitan Police's experience of evaluating witness statements and the medical professional expert opinion of a member of the Royal College of Surgeons. But let us briefly examine this doubtful evidence. Elizabeth Long gave evidence that at 5:30 she passed up Hanbury Street and saw a man and woman talking. By her own account, she paid very little attention to them and said it was typical to see people loitering on the street at this time of the morning. She claims to have heard the man ask, "Will you?" and the woman reply, "Yes." She was paying scant attention to them, yet she could positively identify the woman as the woman she later saw in the mortuary. Wolf van der Linden sums this evidence up nicely by concluding there is not much of Mrs. Long's account which seems to offer positive, credible proof that she had seen Annie Chapman alive. Albert Kadosh, a resident of 27 Hanbury Street, had cause to visit the outhouse in the yard of number 27 a number of times between 5:20 and 5:30 am that morning. Minutes after 5:20, he heard a voice say the word "no." He did not know if this came from number 27, number 25 or number 29, houses of multiple tenancy. Returning to the yard moments later, he heard a sort of fall against the fence, which divided his yard from that of number 29. He then left for work and stated that the time then was 5:32, confirming this by the clock at Spitalfields Church. Nothing of this is valuable evidence. He heard a voice and something go bump in the night. Any number of persons could have been overheard speaking from these three houses and their environs, and any number of things could have caused a sort of fall. So the clincher for the prosecution has to be the evidence given by John Richardson. Following a robbery from the yard of 29 Hanbury Street, it was his habit on market days to look out into the yard from the doorway to ensure everything was in order. It is his evidence that on this occasion he sat down on the step to the yard between 4:45 and 4:50 to cut a piece of leather from his boot with a knife. He did not see anything, certainly not the mutilated body of Annie Chapman at this time. But his account of sitting on the step was not part of his first police interview. On inquiry, the knife he claimed to have used, which he showed to the coroner, was not at all fit for the purpose which he described. Moreover, the door opened out and to his left, and could have covered the body from his view standing or sitting. Between the morning of the crime and his inquest statement, his version of events changed a number of times, so the value of his account is extremely limited. Sunrise on the 8th of September 1888 was at 5:29 am. This was a market day in a densely populated working class street. At 5:30 it would have been morning light. Yes, we may assume the killer was a risk taker. We see this from the evidence in each case, but he was an organised killer. He was not going entirely out of his way to be caught. Annie Chapman was murdered in the darkness at or shortly before 4 am, according to the experienced and expert opinion of Baxter Phillips. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the victims of the double event, do not conform to this route to work commuter killer theory, and neither do they happen in the same 3:20 to 4 am time frame. But we would not expect this in their case. These crimes happened after midnight on Sunday the 30th of September. The first in Berner Street, far south of the east-west commuter route of the psychological barrier that was the Whitechapel Road, and the second in Mitre Square. Sunday trading was not legalised in England and Wales until the Sunday Trading Act of 1994, and so Charles Lechmere would not have been working the following day. This is not enough to raise suspicion, but when we consider what he was likely to have been doing on the Saturday night, we see another connection to the routes Lechmere would have taken. It is known from the records that his mother, Maria Louisa, was living at number 1 Mary Ann Street, and one of Charles's daughters was living there at that address with her. In fact, there are a number of addresses around Mary Ann Street in St George in the East associated with Charles Lechmere. This is the area where he grew up. Walking north from Mary Ann Street towards the Whitechapel Road would have taken Lechmere through Berner Street, where the attack on Stride was disturbed. Later, after the butchery of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, the evidence of the torn piece of bloody apron demonstrates the killer was making his way north-east in the direction of Charles Lechmere's commuter route back to his home on Doveton Street. You can see the previous episode for a detailed discussion of Lechmere and the double event murders. The case against the accused, Charles Allen Lechmere, is entirely circumstantial. There is no smoking gun, but the Crown has shown how this evidence accumulates into what may only be described as a superabundance around the accused. And this is not the presentation of the Book of Evidence in its entirety. Holmgren and Stow, to whom I am greatly indebted, have amassed a mountain of evidence linking Charles Lechmere to the Ripper murders, and indeed other murders happening around this time. Each of the victims died at a place Lechmere was likely to be, and at a time he was likely to be there, not only on his commuter route, but also in the north-south route between his Doveton Street home and that of his mother in Mary Ann Street. His behaviour at the scene of Mary Ann Nichols' murder is extremely suspicious. And when we add to this the lies he told to the police, the false name he gave at the inquest, and his apparent reluctance to attend the inquest, Mr Lechmere, the accused, seems to tug on the finger of suspicion. Moreover, the defence cannot present a single piece of documentary evidence supporting its claim he used the name Cross for employment purposes. While the case for the prosecution is circumstantial, based on a metric ton of compelling and incriminating circumstantial evidence, the case for the defence is built on nothing more than a single fragile and desperate supposition. The defence is a house built on sand. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I thank you for your attention, and the Crown rests its case.